This video begins a series of lectures on the canon of the Old Testament, and we'll deal with the question of, is the Apocrypha to be considered part of the canon? And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. First of all, what is the canon? The canon refers to an authoritative list of books which are regarded by a given religious community as Holy Scripture. Now, the origin of the word canon goes back to the Greek word for rod, kanon. The Greek itself was actually derived from kana, a reed, which comes from an Akkadian word, kanu'u, a reed or measuring rod, or a measure of a length. You can see a Mediterranean reed pictured here. But anyway, in the church, the term canon came to be used as something referring to those books regarded as true scripture and are therefore the rule or the standard or the model or the rod by which we can measure and determine the true Christian faith. The Greek word canon has been applied in this sense by the church since the 4th century. It was first used by Athanasius around 367. Now, canon is rather important because it has to do with the issue of the extent of biblical authority. And it's also important because it's an issue that divides Catholics and Orthodox from Protestants, and to some degree, Catholics and Orthodox from each other. Now, canon has been important in some theological discussions in recent decades. It became popular among Old Testament scholars, especially these two gentlemen pictured here. The first, Reverend Childs, wrote an introduction to the Old Testament as Scripture back in 1979. I would describe him as a neo-Orthodox theologian, taught at Yale University. He emphasized the need to look at the final form of the text, how it served the early Jewish community who accepted it as canonical rather than its original meaning. And hence, although Childs accepted the JEDP and multiple authors for Isaiah, the critical theories of his day, he claims that criticism is misguided in expending so much energy investigating the prehistory of the text. Rather, it's the final form and the religious meaning of the canonical community which they attach to the text that should be the prime object for the Christian who accepts the Bible as Scripture. So the real Sitz und Leben for the Old Testament is not the time of the composition of the individual parts, but the time when the final product was accepted as canonical. Even though there may have been multiple layers in Isaiah, Childs says it's the modified Isaiah, which blurs the original historical Isaiah with the later prophets, who adapted Isaiah's message to a later community. It's that which is canonical. Of course, you could ask the question, well, why accept historically flawed and or distorted materials as canonical? But that's the approach that Childs took. Another one that was into canon criticism was James Sanders. He wrote a book, Torah and Canon, back in 1974. I'd call him a liberal theologian. He emphasized the historical process of how the canonical books reached their present form rather than the final form, which is what Childs would have emphasized. Anyway, he sees the Bible not as a source of authority, but as a mirror in which the church sees her own reflection, a rather weak view of biblical authority. Now, there are different views of Old Testament canon, and different theological traditions. In the traditional Protestant view, the canon consists of the 39 books of the English Old Testament. And the Protestant Old Testament canon, as it turns out, is identical with the entire Jewish canon. All the books that traditional Judaism accepted as scripture, the traditional Protestant holds to be the Old Testament part of scripture. But then there are traditional Catholic and Orthodox views of the Old Testament canon. And they differ from Protestants in that they accept certain other books as a part of the Old Testament that neither Jews nor Protestants accept. And these books are called the books of the Apocrypha. They are books like 1st and 2nd Ezra's and Tobit and Judith and additions to Esther and Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus, also known as Sirach, and a whole list of these books. And traditional Catholics and Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, will accept most of these books as a part of Old Testament scripture. Now, when you get down to the details, it gets kind of complicated. And so this shows you the details. And so, column 1, you have the books accepted by Catholics, including Tobit and Judith and Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus and Baruch and 1st and 2nd Maccabees and the letter of Jeremiah, which is an addition to the book of Jeremiah. There are also certain additions to Esther. There's a prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Young Men, which is an addition to Daniel. There's Susanna, which is another addition to the book of Daniel, and Bel and the Dragon, yet another addition to the book of Daniel. All 12 of those are accepted by Roman Catholics. But then, judging from what they print in their Bibles, they do print 1st Ezra's, 2nd Ezra's, and the Prayer of Manasseh in an appendix to the New Testament in the 1592 Vulgate Bible. So that suggests they accept those books as well. But they don't print other books of the Apocrypha, Psalm 151 in certain manuscripts of the Septuagint. There's a extra Psalm 151. They don't print that. They don't print 3rd Maccabees. They don't print 4th Maccabees. Now, when you get to Greek Orthodoxy, again, we're judging by how they print in their Bibles. My source for this, by the way, is the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha of the RSV, 1977. I believe this was compiled by Bruce Metzger. But anyway, Greek Orthodox accept all 12 of the first 12 books that are accepted by Catholics, but they print without any distinction 1st Ezra's and the Prayer of Manasseh. And they also print, again, not found in the Latin Vulgate, they also print Psalm 151 and 3rd Maccabees, but then they don't have 4th Maccabees. And they don't, I should say 4th Maccabees was printed as an appendix to the Greek Orthodox Bible, and they don't print 2nd Ezra's, which is in the Latin Vulgate. And if you get to Russian Orthodoxy in the Slavonic Bibles, they again print all 12 that are in the Roman Catholic first 12. But then they print without distinction 1st and 2nd Ezra, Psalm 151, and 3rd Maccabees. But then they don't print the Prayer of Manasseh, which is in the Vulgate, and they don't print 4th Maccabees, which is in the Greek Orthodox Bibles. So even these three traditions that accept most of the Apocrypha don't totally agree with each other as to which books belong in. But they're all radically different than the Protestant Bible, which only prints the books of the Hebrew canon and no other books. So let's look at this. You have Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican views of the Old Testament. Since the Council of Trent in 1546, most of the Apocrypha was officially put in Roman Catholic Bibles and are considered a part of the Roman Catholic canon. They're given the name deuterocanonical in the sense that they were canonized later in time. And so they call them the deuterocanonicals, but they considered them fully part of the scripture. Orthodoxy has been less clear. And as we just saw, they print most of the Apocrypha in their Bibles. But the view that only the Hebrew Bible is fully canonical seems to be gaining ground. Authority for orthodoxy, as it turns out, is the seamless web of tradition. And so, because the deuterocanonical books are a part of the tradition, well, whether it's scripture or whether it's tradition, it's kind of a seamless web, and you can don't have to insist on deciding which books are in the canon, which books are not, as long as they're a part of the overall tradition. Now, the Anglicans actually compromised on this point of view. The Anglican Church did not accept as scripture the deuterocanonical books, but regarded them as worthy of study and devotion. And so the bottom line is that for the Anglican tradition, the deuterocanonical books are kind of semi-canonical, not quite canonical, but not quite, not canonical too. And so the question then is, did Protestants make a mistake in rejecting these books of the Apocrypha? Now, before I go on to talk about that a bit more, I should mention that there are some other views that have circulated over the years on, particularly more modern views on the canon. For example, a 20th century Harvard archaeologist theologian by the name of G.E. Wright argued for the point of view called a canon within the canon. In other words, you have the canon, those are the books that came to be recognized as scripture, but some of those books are more inspired than others. And so there's a canon within the canon. Some books are really important. Some books, well, you could live without if you really wanted to. It turns out that Jews have always kind of looked at their scripture that way. They accept all the books of the Protestant Old Testament as scripture, but they always have considered the Torah, the Pentateuch, to be the most important. And so even though they accept as canonical the prophets and the writings, nonetheless, the Torah is the essential Bible for traditional Judaism. On the other hand, liberal Protestants always considered the prophets with their social justice message to be more important than other parts of the Bible. And lest we be overly critical of these other traditions, liberal Protestants and Jews, I should mention that we evangelical Protestants are often de facto canon within the canon people, because we're likely as not, in at least a lot of our churches, to elevate Paul's writing to a canon within the canon status. In other words, we're going to look a whole lot more at the Pauline epistles than the other epistles in the New Testament, and maybe even more than the Gospels. So there's always that tendency to exalt certain parts of Scripture above other parts of Scripture. Now, why should we not do a canon within the canon? And at least one argument against it is it's rather subjective. Who is to say which parts of Scripture is more inspired than other parts? And the whole idea of a canon within a canon makes the authority of Scripture in general and the Old Testament in particular a bit of a mess. So that's one argument against it. There are other liberal views. New Testament scholar Rudolf Bultmann and church historian from the late 19th century, Adolf von Harnack, they both propose just eliminating the entire Old Testament from the Christian canon. We got the New Testament. The New Testament we like better. We don't really like the Old Testament, so let's just look at the New Testament and not pay much attention to the Old. And then there's an idea that, well, maybe we could just eliminate the concept of canon altogether. Anglican scholar James Barr, back in the 20th century, late 20th century, he argued that the idea of a canon was a mere accident of human rather than divine decisions and is of limited value. And so, in his view, the church is free to change its canon if it so wishes. Now, there were a number of ancient views of the canon that would be worth mentioning as well. A famous view of the canon that came early on came from a man by the name of Marcion, and you can tell by the title of the book about him. Marcion was condemned by the church as a heretic. Anyway, in his view of the canon, he actually rejected the entire Old Testament from his canon. But then he went even beyond that. He rejected most of the New Testament books from his canon as well. At the end of the day, he had basically an edited version of Luke's gospel and most of Paul's epistles, and that was Marcion's entire canon. And he believed that the Old Testament God was a God of law and judgment, and that the Old Testament God was incompatible with Paul's gospel of grace, and therefore he rejected the Old Testament. He's a little bit like Bultmann and von Harnack, who rejected the Old Testament because they didn't much like the message of that part of Scripture. But the church as a whole condemned Marcion as a heretic. Another ancient view is the Samaritan canon. The Samaritan canon consists solely of the Pentateuch. That is, they only accepted as scripture the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And there was a split between the Samaritans and the Jews. And one of the questions that people raise: did that split take place before the Jews accepted as canonical the books of the prophets and the writings? Or did they split from the Jews before those other books came to be recognized as scripture? You might see here the script. Those of you that may have studied Hebrew will notice that the Hebrew alphabet that the Samaritan Pentateuch uses is rather different than the traditional texts that we have in our printed Hebrew Bibles. Another question that comes up has to do with the Septuagint and what canon the translators of the Septuagint accepted. Because when you look at the Septuagint, printed in the Septuagint manuscripts are not only the books of the Old Testament, as in the Hebrew canon, but also the books of the Apocrypha. Now, it's not every book of the Apocrypha in every manuscript of the Septuagint, but books of the Apocrypha show up in various manuscripts, and that's the origin of our original texts of those things. It also, by the way, organizes the books differently than the Hebrew Bible organizes books. And the issue then, does this inclusion of books of the Apocrypha in Septuagint manuscripts imply a different canon for the Jews in Egypt? You might recall that the Septuagint was produced by Jewish scholars in Egypt, according to the tradition. And so did the Jews in Egypt have a different canon than the Jews in Palestine and Babylonia? Did they have an Alexandrian canon? The canon that would have been recognized by Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. Here's a little bit more detail on books of the Apocrypha in some important Septuagint manuscripts. You have Codex Sinaiticus, which was produced in the 4th century. And it also has the New Testament. It's important for New Testament textual criticism. But in that manuscript, it has a number of books of the Apocrypha: Tobit, Judith, 1st and 4th Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach. It also has some church father writings, the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. The Codex Alexandrinus dates to the 5th century, and it includes all the books of the Catholic Apocrypha. It also has Psalm 151, 3rd and 4th Maccabees, and then some other things, 14 odes, which are liturgical canticles, and the Epistle of Clement. He was a church father. And Athanasius's preface to Psalms. Athanasius was a Alexandrian church father. And also the Psalms of Solomon appear to be originally a part of this manuscript, although they have been lost over the centuries. And then if you go to another famous manuscript, Codex Vaticanus, all of these also have New Testament and or early New Testament codices. Codex means it was a book. But anyway, the Apocrypha, except none of the books of Maccabees and the Paramanasseh are in Codex Vaticanus. So again, it varies from manuscript to manuscript exactly what books of the Apocrypha are there, but most of them have at least some, if not the majority of the books of the Apocrypha in their printed editions. And so again, the question is raised, did they consider these books that they printed in their Bibles canonical? Of course, if you follow that, then you might have to add the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas and the preface of Athanasius to the Psalms as scripture too. But so perhaps one should not press it overly far, but nonetheless, that raises the question. There's also a question of, was there a different canon at Qumran, which is where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls? And the most important thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that, well, Esther was not found among the manuscripts there. They have at least a fragment of every book of the Old Testament, but there's not a single fragment of the book of Esther. And that raises the question, why is Esther not there? Is it because they didn't accept Esther as a part of the canon? Yeah, that could be the explanation. And so it raises that question. Moreover, at Qumran, they also had in their library lots of other books. They had a sectarian document. They had a number of sectarian documents. One of the bigger ones is called the Temple Scroll. They had some of the pseudepigraphic works, Jubilees and Enoch. Those are books not in any of the major Christian canons, but were early writings, Jubilees and the Book of Enoch. And they had a couple of the books of the Apocrypha, the Book of Tobit and the Book of Ecclesiasticus, also called Sirach. And Again, does the fact that they had these books in their library, plus some others not mentioned here, did that mean that they accepted those books as scripture as well? Now, a quick remark on the other scriptures at Qumran. Well, Qumran, you have to bear in mind, was a sect of some religious people that went away from the rest of society and did their own thing by the Dead Sea. They would not be considered necessarily normative Judaism. Moreover, the absence of Esther could be an accident of preservation rather than non-canonical. Maybe some of the caves had Esther scrolls in them, and maybe somebody found them and took them off, or maybe they rotted away because they were put in a place that was more exposed to weather, and so on and so forth. And so, the absence of Esther doesn't prove that Esther was non-canonical. And of course, if you make ownership of books proof that an owner considers a book scripture, well, I would be heretical because I have a copy of the Quran and I have a copy of the Book of Mormon, and yet I don't consider those scripture, even though some people in the world do. Now, usage does give evidence of a canon at Qumran. They did write commentaries on certain books. There's commentaries on Habakkuk, where they give the Hebrew text and then they give comment on that Hebrew text. And it looks like they accepted the law and the prophets and the Psalms, which they wrote commentaries on. Um, Also, Daniel and Job, just from the comments they make in the sectarian literature. And also, one of the works, the Zadokite work, or the Book of the Covenant of Damascus, is a Qumran sectarian document. And when it quotes from Scripture, it quotes from the Hebrew Bible, but never quotes from the Apocrypha or the Temple Scroll or any other sectarian document. So that, at least on the surface, may suggest that even though they had other books that they considered important, they don't seem to treat them on the same level as Scripture. And so F. Bruce, who wrote a very good book, The Canon of Scripture, he gives a summary of what he thinks was going on at Qumran. He said that it's probable, indeed, that by the beginning of the Christian era, the Essenes, including the Qumran community, were in substantial agreement with the Pharisees and the Sadducees about the limits of Hebrew Scripture. In other words, they accepted, in all probability, according to Bruce, uh, the Hebrew Bible, that's the Protestant Old Testament canon. Uh, and so they did accept the law. Unlike mainstream Judaism, they probably did not accept the tradition of the rabbis, which is called the oral law. Now, certain rabbis also rejected some of the biblical books. All but 5 books of the Hebrew Bible were accepted universally. But among the rabbis in Jewish tradition, there were some 5 books that were questioned by some rabbi or another. One of the books is the book of Ezekiel. And the reason that the rabbis that question this book give is that it contradicts, it has some ritual law in the description of the temple in Ezekiel 40 through 48, a future temple. But that temple instructions in some ways is hard to reconcile with Leviticus. And so the Babylonian Talmud Shabbat 13b argues that, well, maybe Ezekiel should be rejected from the canon because it contradicts the Torah. Likewise, Proverbs is questioned as being a part of the canon, in part because of a contradiction that all readers of the Bible run into when they read through Proverbs. Uh, Proverbs 24 and verse 4, do not answer a fool according to his folly. Then 26 5, answer a fool according to his folly. Well, which is it? Don't answer them according to their folly, or do answer them. And so that looks like a contradiction, and that led some to question whether it deserved to be in the canon. Then you have Ecclesiastes, which they question because it's pretty secular, is not real religious in its language and the like. And in some ways, it seems to be heretical. There are certain verses that are hard to reconcile with each other. And so you can look it up later, but Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 3 and chapter 2 and verse 2 seem to be in tension with each other. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 15 and also 2 and 2 seem to be hard to reconcile with each other as well. And so for those kinds of reasons, and the radical skepticism that Ecclesiastes seems to show, has led a few rabbis to suggest that, well, maybe Ecclesiastes should not be in the canon. And then Song of Songs was questioned in the Tosefta, Sanhedrin 12:10, and also in the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 101a. They question Song of Songs essentially because it's secular, it doesn't ever mention God in the entire book, and also because it seems to be a bit little too racy, a little too erotic for their tastes. And then finally, the Book of Esther, partly because it's secular, because there's no a mention of God directly in the book, unless you allegorize it. And if you take it literally, there seems to be no mention of God in the book. Also, Esther marries a pagan, and that seems an inappropriate thing for a Jewish woman to do. And then it also introduces the Feast of Purim, and Purim is found only in Esther. It's not in the Torah. It's not in the Law of Moses. And they felt it was unwarranted to add a festival not found in the Torah. And so some rabbis rejected that book as well. So Ezekiel, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Esther were at some point by one rabbi or another questioned as to whether or not they should have been in the canon. So the key issue then is, does the evidence from the Septuagint, from Qumran, and from the rabbis prove that the canon was still open in the first century of the Christian era? But we'll talk more about that in the next part of our lecture.